Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The thing about arenas like the one in Kansas City is that they carry memories. Some are loud and electric, like the roar of a packed crowd, and others are quieter. The kind of quiet that settles into the bones of a place, waiting for the right or wrong moment to resurface. That night, I should have left with the rest of the crew. It was late, and the echoes of the show still hung faintly in the air. Most of the guys had cleared out, eager to hit the road or grab a drink. But me? I stayed behind. I was working on a new finisher, something that could pop the crowd, and I wanted to run through it a few more times in my head before heading home. The locker room was eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. I sat on the bench, lacing up my boots out of habit. Even though the night was done, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a dull, yellowish glow that made everything look older than it was. And that's when I heard it, a whisper. At first, it was so faint I thought it might be my imagination. Just the creak of the old pipes or the hum of the lights. But then it came again, low and deliberate. "Who's there?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. No answer. I laughed nervously, convincing myself it was nothing. I leaned down to tie the other boot, but the whisper turned into something else, a growl. Low, guttural, and coming from somewhere just behind me. My breath caught in my throat as a sudden scrape echoed through the room. It was metal on metal, sharp and deliberate. I whipped around, my eyes darting toward the lockers. One of the doors had shifted slightly, just enough to make a sound. It was barely moving, but it was moving. My heart was pounding now, the rational part of my brain trying to override the primal fear that had begun to creep in. "All right, very funny," I said, my voice faltering. "Whoever's doing this, you got me." Nothing. The locker door slammed shut with a deafening clang. I jumped to my feet, my pulse thundering in my ears. The air had changed. It was colder now, unnaturally so. I could see my breath forming faint white clouds in front of me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was the middle of summer, and yet the room felt like a freezer. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall, tall and distorted, its shape shifting like smoke caught in a draft. At first, I thought it was just the flicker of the old lights playing tricks on me. But as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't my shadow. It was standing still, and yet it moved. I backed away slowly, my boots squeaking on the tiled floor. The shadow stopped, lingering by the row of lockers. Then it stretched impossibly long, creeping across the ceiling like a living thing. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose flight. I didn't bother grabbing my gear. I just ran. My legs carried me down the hall, through the maze of corridors, until I burst out into the parking lot. The warm night air hit me like a wave, and I collapsed against the side of my car, gasping for breath. It took me a while to calm down enough to drive. Even then, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow, the growl, the cold. It didn't feel real, but at the same time, it felt too real to ignore. The next day, I went back to grab my gear, hoping to laugh it off as a late-night hallucination. That's when I met the janitor. He was an older guy, the kind who's seen it all and doesn't scare easily. When I told him what happened, his face grew serious. "You're not the first," he said, leaning on his mop. "This place is history. Years ago, back in the 80s, there was a wrestler, big guy, real promising, who died right in that locker room. Heart attack, they said, but some folks think it was more than that. Said he was pushed too hard, too fast. The pressure got to him. He paused, glancing toward the hallway that led back to the locker room. Some say he never left. I wanted to argue, to tell him it was nonsense, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, grabbed my bag, and left as quickly as I could. Even now, I can't step into a locker room without feeling that chill. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just a lingering memory of one bad night. But deep down, I know better. Some places don't forget, and some shadows, they don't go away. Story 2. Wrestling fans, you meet them all the time. Some are loud and excitable. Others are shy and wide-eyed. But every now and then, there's one who lingers in your mind long after the encounter. This story is about one of those fans, a boy I'll never forget, though part of me wishes I could. It was a humid summer evening in Detroit, the kind where the air feels heavy and the shadows stretch longer than they should. We just wrapped up an electrifying show. The adrenaline was still coursing through me as I sat at the autograph table, fans lining up with their posters, t-shirts, and memorabilia. The room buzzed with excitement, the kind of energy that makes you feel invincible. The line moved quickly, faces blurring together in a mix of grins and chatter. And then I saw him, a kid, maybe 12 or 13, standing a little apart from the others. He was pale, almost unnaturally so, with dark circles under his eyes. He clutched a photograph in his hands, his grip tight like it was the most precious thing in the world. What caught my attention first was his shirt. It was old, faded, and bore the image of a wrestler from the 1980s. The guy had been a legend in his time, known for his high-risk moves and fearless attitude. But he was also a cautionary tale. A tragic in-ring accident had ended his life in a way no one who loved wrestling could forget. The boy stepped forward, placing the photograph in front of me. It was a black and white promo shot of that same wrestler. His eyes, bright and alive in the photo, stared back at me like they had something to say. "Can you sign this?" the boy asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. Something about him put me on edge, though I couldn't explain why. "Was he your favorite?" "No," the boy replied, his tone flat but not rude. "He was my dad's favorite." That gave me pause. There was a weight to his words, something heavy and unspoken. Still, I took my marker and scrawled my signature across the bottom of the photo. When I handed it back, the boy looked at it for a long moment, then at me. His eyes were dark, deep, and unsettling. "Thank you," he said. I nodded, watching as he stepped away. He didn't leave, though. He lingered at the edge of the room, standing in the corner, his eyes fixed on me. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the next fan in line, but I could feel his gaze. It was like a shadow that wouldn't let go. By the time the event wound down, I was exhausted. I glanced over to the corner where the boy had been, but he was gone. I didn't see him leave, which was strange because the room wasn't that big. As I started packing up, one of the event staff approached me, holding something in his hand. "Hey," he said, his voice tinged with confusion. This was on the table. It was the photograph, the one I had signed, but the signature wasn't mine. I frowned, taking the picture from him. My heart skipped a beat. The signature on the photo wasn't just unfamiliar. It was the name of the wrestler in the picture. I stared at it, my mind racing. I knew my own signature, knew the way my hand moved when I wrote my name. This wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. The ink was fresh, the letters bold and clean, as if he had just signed it himself. "That's weird," I muttered, though the word didn't come close to capturing how I felt. The staffer shrugged, clearly unnerved. "Maybe someone's playing a prank," he suggested. I nodded, though I didn't believe it. There was no way anyone else had signed that photo. No one else had touched it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face, pale and somber, his eyes full of something I couldn't name. I thought about the wrestler, about his tragic death, and the legacy he'd left behind. I thought about the boy's words. He was my dad's favorite, and wondered if they meant more than I'd realized. The next day, I mentioned the incident to one of the older wrestlers who'd been around in the 80s. His face went pale when I told him about the boy and the photo. "That arena," he said, his voice low, "has a reputation. They say it's haunted. Fans talk about seeing things, shadows, figures, stuff like that. And the guy you're talking about, the one in the photo, he wrestled his last match there. That's where he died." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces fit too well. The boy's vintage shirt, his eerie demeanor, the signature that wasn't mine. It all pointed to something I couldn't explain. I never saw the boy again. But sometimes, when I'm signing autographs, I catch myself looking up, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me with those dark, unsettling eyes. And when I do, I wonder, was he even real, or was he something else? Something tied to the shadows of a past that refuses to let go? I guess I'll never know. But one thing's for sure. There's some fans you never forget. Story 3. It was the kind of arena you'd expect to see in a small, forgotten town. A place where the echoes of past wrestling events seemed to linger in the stale air, like the remnants of a long-forgotten memory. It was run down, old, with creaky wooden bleachers that groaned every time you stepped on them. The kind of place where you could feel the weight of history in every inch of the cracked walls. It had hosted matches for decades, but the years had not been kind to it. Dust settled like a blanket over the seats, which hadn't seen a real audience in years. But despite its age and neglect, it was still standing, still clinging to its place in the world. And tonight, it would be our stage. I've been working with my partner, preparing for a match, rehearsing our moves, the choreography that would be seen by thousands. Except tonight, there was no one. Just the two of us, a few creaky lights, and the faint smell of mildew and sweat in the air. But even though the place was empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you from behind, even though you're sure no one's there. I tried to focus on my partner, tried to stay locked into the rhythm of our movements, but the sensation kept crawling under my skin. The seats, Those ancient, rotting seats seemed to watch us too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but glance around every now and then, my eyes darting up toward the stands. "Are you all right?" my partner Joey asked, looking over at me. There was something in his voice, a subtle hint of unease, that made me realize he could feel it too. "Something's off, man." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yeah, I don't know, man. It feels like we're not alone." Joey gave a nervous laugh, but I could tell he wasn't really laughing. He kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. We moved through the rehearsals, but the unease in the air only grew heavier. The lights flickered overhead as I climbed up to the turnbuckle for one of my finishing moves. The crowd was supposed to cheer when I nailed it, but there was no crowd tonight, just the silent void of the empty arena. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. As I stood there, my hands gripping the ropes, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe my mind was playing games with me. But no, it was real. A faint outline of figures sitting in the upper stands, as if they were ghosts, shadows of people who had long since passed. They were there, clear as day, and they weren't just sitting quietly. No, they were clapping, faintly, almost like a distant echo, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was like 1,000 silent hands clapping, as if the crowd was alive but not quite. I froze, my blood running cold. Joey, noticing the shift in my stance, looked up at me, then followed my gaze. His face turned pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice low, like I was afraid to disturb whatever it was that had taken residence in the stands. Joey didn't answer at first. He just stared, his eyes flicking between the empty seats and me, as if he was trying to decide if he was losing his mind or if something truly strange was happening. Finally, he muttered, "Let's just finish up and get the hell out of here." His voice shook, and I could tell he was trying to hold it together. But I didn't want to finish. I wanted to leave. Something was wrong here. I had spent enough time in arenas and stadiums to know when something wasn't right. But this place, it felt different. As if the very walls were watching us, waiting for something. We quickly wrapped up the rehearsal, neither of us saying much, the clapping still faintly echoing in our ears as we made our way to the dressing room. The hairs on my arms stood on end as we walked past the rows of empty chairs. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air growing heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. As we packed up our gear, a local staff member came over to me. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, wearing a faded wrestling crew t-shirt. He looked like he had seen a lot of things in his time, and his eyes were shadowed with the kind of tiredness that comes from years of work in a place like this. "You two doing okay?" he asked, his voice gruff, like he was used to asking the same question, but not always expecting a real answer. "We're fine," I replied, trying to brush off the eerie feeling in my chest. "Just a little tired. This place is old." He gave me a knowing look, and I swear, it was like he was sizing me up. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again, his voice low. "You know, this place has a reputation." I frowned, not understanding. "Reputation?" He nodded. "The place is haunted. They say the spirits of old wrestling fans still come here. They sit in those seats, clapping, watching the matches like they never left. People say they can feel it, but not everyone believes it. I stared at him, thinking he was just messing with us. You mean ghosts? I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood, but deep down, something told me he wasn't kidding. The old man's eyes darkened. Yeah, ghosts. They don't hurt nobody, but they've been here for years. Just don't go up to the upper stands after dark, alright? There's stories about that too. I laughed it off at the time. We were tired, stressed from the rehearsal, and I figured he was just some old guy telling stories to pass the time. But even as we drove out of the arena that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching us. The faint echoes of clapping that seemed to follow us, lingering in the back of my mind. It wasn't until the next day that I truly understood what had happened. I had asked the tech crew to send me the footage from our practice, just to review some moves and get a feel for how everything looked. As I watched the video, everything seemed normal at first. Joey and I were moving through the match, practicing our spots, nothing out of the ordinary. Then the footage shifted. At first, I thought it was a glitch, just a strange flicker in the video. But no, the figures were there, faint and translucent, sitting in the upper rows. And they weren't just sitting still, they were clapping, their hands silent in the video, but unmistakably there. A few even seemed to stand, though they were nothing more than blurry shadows against the empty stands. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I rewound the footage, then watched it again and again, hoping I was just seeing things. But the figures remained, and they were still clapping. I couldn't explain it. I still can't. The arena had no fans that night, no one but Joey and me. And yet, there they were, those phantom spectators, watching us like they had for decades, never leaving. I've been to plenty of arenas in my career, but none like that. None that felt like they were alive, breathing with a history that stretched beyond the living. But that place, that old wrestling arena in the Midwest, it was something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I'm not sure I want to know what it was. All I know is that every time I close my eyes, I hear the faint clapping, and I can never shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the shadows of those old, forgotten stands, the crowd is still watching, waiting, clapping,